The airport buzzed with noise, announcements crackling over the speakers, rolling suitcases clacking against tile, tired travelers sighing as they shuffled toward their gates. Near gate B12, a man stood slightly apart from the crowd, his posture stiff but his eyes calm. His name was Mark Reynolds, and the cane in his right hand wasn't just for balance. It was a reminder of things he'd rather forget. He adjusted the brim of his veteran's hat and stepped forward, his bad leg dragging just enough to notice. The line moved slowly, but he didn't mind waiting. He'd waited through worse. When it was finally his turn, he handed his ticket to the woman behind the counter, Jessica, according to her name tag. She barely glanced at him before tapping at her keyboard with sharp, impatient keystrokes. "Boarding pass," she said, not looking up. Mark handed it over. She scanned it, paused, then finally met his eyes. "You can't board without pre-approved assistance." Mark blinked. "Ma'am." "Policy," she said, sliding his ticket back. "No exceptions." Around them, passengers turned to look. Someone's phone camera lifted. Mark's grip tightened on his cane. He had survived firefights, roadside bombs, months of rehab, but this was something else entirely. And then from the jet bridge, a voice cut through the murmurs. "Is there a problem here?" Every head turned. The pilot stood there, still in his cap and uniform, his gaze locked on Jessica. She stiffened. "Captain Harris, I was just—" But the pilot wasn't listening to her. He was looking at Mark, and in that moment everything was about to change. Mark's fingers tightened around his cane as Jessica's words hung in the air. "Policy," she'd said, like that explained everything. Like it made sense to turn away a man who'd served 2 tours overseas over something as simple as boarding a plane. Around them, the crowd of passengers shifted, their murmurs growing louder. Someone's phone camera was definitely recording now. "I have documentation," Mark said, keeping his voice steady as he reached for his wallet. His VA card was right there, folded behind his ID. Jessica barely glanced at it. "Doesn't matter. You should have arranged assistance when you booked." A woman in line behind Mark huffed, "Oh, come on." Jessica's glare shut her up fast. Mark exhaled slowly. He knew this dance, the bureaucracy, the dismissive looks, the way people saw the cane before they saw him. He could walk away, find another flight, but something about the way Jessica was watching him like she'd already won made his jaw clench. "I served in Afghanistan," he said, quieter this time. "I think I can handle a damn jet bridge." A few passengers gasped. Someone muttered, "Damn right." Jessica's lips thinned. "Sir, if you can't follow procedure, I'll have to call security." That's when the whispers really started. Security. For a veteran. A teenage boy near the front of the line looked at his mom, wide-eyed. An older man in a business suit shook his head. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Ma'am." Every head turned. Captain Harris stood at the entrance to the jet bridge, his pilot's cap shadowing his eyes. He wasn't smiling. Jessica paled. "Captain, this passenger is refusing." "I heard." Harris stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. Then, without another word to Jessica, he turned to Mark, held out his hand. "Sir, if you'll follow me." The entire gate fell silent. Mark hesitated. "I don't want trouble." Harris's gaze flicked to Mark's veteran's hat, then back to his face. "Neither do I," he said, "but I know disrespect when I see it." And just like that, the tide turned. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The passengers erupted into applause, and Mark felt something he hadn't in years seen. The applause from the crowd seemed to hang in the air as Captain Harris maintained his outstretched hand. Mark hesitated only a moment before gripping it. The pilot's handshake was firm, his palms rough in a way that suggested he'd done more than just fly planes. Without another glance at the stunned gate agent, Harris turned and guided Mark toward the jet bridge, his voice low but carrying. 20 years Air Force before I flew commercial, Harris said casually, as if they were discussing the weather. Recognized that hat the moment I saw you. The murmurs of the crowd followed them down the narrow corridor. Mark could feel dozens of eyes on his back, could hear the rapid clicking of smartphone cameras capturing every moment. His cane tapped rhythmically against the metal flooring, each step sending a dull ache up his leg that he stubbornly ignored. When they reached the aircraft door, Harris stopped abruptly. He turned to face the gathering crowd of passengers who had followed at a respectful distance. With the practiced command of a military officer, he raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man served our country. The least we can do is serve him." A flight attendant appeared at Harris's shoulder, her eyes wide. "Captain, first class is full, but we can." "Give him my seat," Harris interrupted. "I'll ride jump." The murmurs turned to outright cheers as the pilot plucked the veteran's hat from Mark's head and held it up. "This right here, this means something." Mark felt his throat tighten as Harris placed the hat back on his head with surprising gentleness. The flight attendant, now smiling through tears, gestured toward the front of the plane. "Right this way, sir." As Mark moved down the aisle, passengers reached out to pat his shoulders. A young girl offered him a small American flag she'd been carrying. An elderly woman grasped his hand and whispered, "Thank you," with such sincerity it nearly buckled his knees. In first class, a businessman was already gathering his things from the spacious seat Harris had surrendered. "Honor's mine," the man said gruffly, avoiding Mark's eyes as he moved to a middle seat in coach. From the cockpit doorway, Harris watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. His gaze then shifted to the front of the plane where Jessica, the gate agent, stood frozen in the entryway, her face ashen. The captain's expression hardened. He moved toward her, speaking too low for others to hear. "You're relieved of this flight. Get off my plane." As Jessica turned and fled, the cabin door closed with finality. The engines roared to life. And for the first time in years, Mark Reynolds sat back in his seat, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to simply be. The hum of the jet engines filled the cabin as the plane climbed through the clouds. Mark stared out the window, watching the city shrink below. The same city where, just 30 minutes ago, he'd been just another inconvenience to someone like Jessica. Now, buckled into a first-class seat he hadn't paid for, surrounded by passengers who kept sneaking glances at him, he wasn't sure what to do with his hands. A tap on his shoulder made him turn. Captain Harris stood in the aisle holding 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding to the empty seat beside Mark. The flight attendant had already set up a temporary workstation for Harris in the jump seat near the cockpit, but the captain seemed determined to stay close. Mark shifted to make room. "You didn't have to do all this," Mark said as Harris handed him a coffee. Harris shrugged. "Yeah, I did." He took a slow sip, then glanced at Mark's leg. "IED." The question was casual, but Mark felt it like a punch to the chest. He hadn't talked about it in years, not to strangers, not even to most of his VA counselors. But something about Harris's tone, the way he asked like he already knew the answer, made the words come easier. "Outside Kandahar," Mark admitted. 2012. My team was clearing a village when his grip tightened around the coffee cup. "Well, you know how it goes." Harris nodded. "Marine." "Army, 75th Ranger Regiment." A flicker of recognition passed over Harris's face. "Then we might have some mutual friends." He leaned back, stretching his legs into the aisle. "I was Air Force pararescue. Spent plenty of time pulling Rangers out of bad situations." Mark studied him differently then. The faint scar along Harris's jawline he hadn't noticed before. The way the captain held himself like someone who'd carried weight before. Pararescue. The guys who jumped into hell to bring soldiers home. No wonder Harris hadn't hesitated at the gate. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the chime of the PA system. Harris stood, giving Mark's shoulder a quick squeeze before moving to the front of the cabin. He took the intercom mic with the ease of a man used to commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we begin our descent, I'd like to take a moment to recognize one of our passengers." His voice carried effortlessly through the plane. Sergeant Mark Reynolds served multiple tours with the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment. While most of us were sleeping safely in our beds, men like him were keeping watch. Today, he was nearly denied a seat on this flight because of an injury sustained in service to this country. A ripple of anger moved through the cabin. Someone near the back shouted, "Shame on them." Harris continued, quieter now, "I think we can all agree that's not how we treat our heroes." He raised his own coffee cup. "To Sergeant Reynolds and to all who serve." The entire plane erupted in applause. Flight attendants wiped their eyes as passengers stood to clap. A young boy in a Spider-Man shirt scrambled into the aisle to salute. Mark, his face burning, could only nod his thanks. When the noise finally died down, Harris returned to his seat. Mark expected some comment about the speech, but the captain just sipped his coffee like nothing had happened. After a long silence, Mark spoke. "You didn't have to do that either." Harris smiled. "Yeah," he said again, "I did." Outside the window, the first lights of their destination city glittered in the distance. Somewhere below, Jessica was probably filling out incident reports, and corporate offices were fielding furious calls. But for now, 30,000 feet in the air, there was just this: two soldiers, a quiet understanding, and the steady rumble of engines carrying them home. By the time the plane touched down, Mark's phone was already buzzing with notifications. Passengers had filmed the entire confrontation at the gate, and now the videos were spreading like wildfire. One clip, titled "Airline Humiliates Disabled Vet, Watch the Pilot's Epic Response," had already racked up 500,000 views. Another showed Captain Harris's speech mid-flight, the cabin erupting in applause. That one had a heart emoji floating over every like. Mark tried to slip out unnoticed, but reporters were already waiting at baggage claim. Camera flashes popped like gunfire as a woman in a red blazer shoved a microphone in his face. "Sergeant Reynolds, how does it feel to be the internet's newest hero?" He ducked his head and kept walking. But the story wouldn't die. By evening, #NotMyPolicy was trending nationwide. News anchors debated airline accessibility policies on primetime TV. The airline's stock price dropped 3% in after-hours trading. And Jessica, her LinkedIn profile vanished overnight. Captain Harris fared better. The Air Force released his service records. Turns out he'd earned a Silver Star for rescuing a downed pilot behind enemy lines. Memes circulated of him photoshopped into Top Gun, captioned, "Not all heroes wear capes, some wear pilot wings." The airline, desperate for good PR, promoted him to Chief Diversity Officer before the week was out. Then came the interview requests. Ellen, Good Morning America, even a tentative feeler from Oprah's team. Mark deleted the emails unread, until one subject line caught his eye: Veterans Advocacy Group Urgent. The director of a national nonprofit sat across from him in a D.C. coffee shop 2 days later. "We want you to testify before Congress," she said, sliding a business card across the table, "about how veterans are treated in civilian spaces." Her pen hovered over a legal pad. "That is, if you're ready to tell your story." Mark stirred his coffee, watching the cream swirl. He thought of Jessica's dismissive smirk, the way Harris hadn't hesitated, the strangers who'd stood up for him. He took a deep breath. "Where do I sign?" Meanwhile, in a corporate office 12 states away, an airline executive slammed his phone down. "We're getting crucified on social media." He rubbed his temples. "Just find that damn gate agent and make her apologize. On camera." The PR team exchanged glances. One intern whispered, "Too late. TMZ already found her working at a car rental place." As for Mark, 3 months later he stood at a podium in the Capitol building, his voice steady as he recounted that day at the airport. Behind him, Captain Harris, now retired from commercial flying, gave an approving nod. "This isn't about me," Mark told the assembled lawmakers. "It's about every veteran who's ever been made to feel invisible." He tapped his cane against the floor for emphasis. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The room erupted in applause. C-SPAN's cameras rolled, and somewhere in the crowd, a young congressional aide was already live-tweeting the whole thing. The story, it seemed, wasn't over yet. Mark Reynolds never set out to become a viral sensation. He was just a soldier trying to board a flight. But sometimes, the smallest moments spark the biggest changes. Today, new legislation bears his name, the Reynolds Act, requiring disability accommodations for all veterans on commercial flights. Captain Harris runs a nonprofit helping wounded warriors transition to civilian careers. And Jessica, she eventually apologized publicly, then left the airline industry altogether, last heard teaching customer service seminars about empathy. As for Mark, you won't find him on social media or talk shows. He's back home in Indiana, mentoring young veterans at the local VFW. But if you ask him about that day at the airport, he'll smile and say, "Funny how one act of decency can change everything." Because that's what this story is really about. Not the outrage, not the viral fame, but the quiet power of doing what's right. So next time you see someone being treated unfairly, remember Captain Harris, remember Mark, and ask yourself, what kind of story will you help write? Share this story if you believe in second chances and everyday heroes. Subscribe for more inspiring true stories.